Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guests today are Mahrs Schoppman and Scott Sessions. Mahrs is a queer and trans somatic psychotherapist with a private practice based in Occidental, California. He specializes in working with queer community and with those who live with the embodied traumatic impacts of growing up in an oppressive religious environment. He is passionate about walking with people on their journeys of reclaiming embodied knowing, sensation, emotional range, and vitality. Currently, he is launching a series of religious trauma therapy groups with an understanding that group-based trauma needs group-based healing. Born queer and raised Orthodox Mormon, Scott knows about navigating worlds that seem like polar opposites. Scott, who now identifies as an agnostic post-Mormon mystic, is developing a career as a spiritual life coach. He helps those who have left restrictive religions to cultivate new spiritual practices that bring healing and inner peace. In addition to coaching, Scott runs monthly reading events, both online and in person, called Queer Bedtime Stories, where folks come together to share and be moved by the words of LGBTQ authors. With a commitment to help meet the spiritual needs of this particular moment, standing firm in both Mormon and queer identities, Scott proudly carries the pioneer tradition into the 21st century. Today we have a roundtable discussion about how Mahrs and Scott both deconstructed their religious practices and reconstructed their spiritual selves. They also share about the work they're each doing now to help others from restrictive religions find a new way back to spirit. Find Mahrs at therapywithmahrs.com. That's therapy with MAHRS.com. And find Scott on Instagram at Scott_strolls. That's Scott_STROLLS. Hi, Mahrs and Scott. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So today we have something a little bit different than I've done before, which is having two different people on the show who don't really know each other. I have had two people on the show, or three people on the show, who all have a friendship or working relationship with each other, but this is the first time it's going to be more of a roundtable discussion, so I'm excited to see what emerges. So to get started, I thought I would have each of you share a little bit more about your background that led you to the work that you're doing now, supporting people who are recovering from religious or spiritual trauma. So Mahrs, why don't you share a little bit more about the community you grew up in and how that sort of brought you to where you are today?
Sure. Thanks, Nick. I grew up in Sacramento, California. I went to a very fundamentalist Baptist school from kindergarten through high school. And then I went to two different evangelical colleges. So my entire education leading up to my master's degree was within a Christian education context, and a very oppressive one at that. The type of school I went to, the fundamentalist Baptist school, was the kind of school where, obviously only two genders existed, and girls had to wear skirts down to their knees with nothing on their shirts and no flip-flops. And all of that was to make sure that boys didn't think lustful thoughts of them, types of things. It was very controlled. No music with a drum beat was allowed. This idea that Satan is the fallen angel of music. And so just really terrifying ideas, with the idea of hell really pushing all of them. So I'm not sure how much to say at this point, but that has really formed so much of who I am in the world. It really formed an embodiment that felt a lot more like a disembodiment. And I, in my adult life, had to do a lot of work to really reclaim my body, my sensations, my desire. And I'm still doing that work, but I've come a long way. And it kind of just, when I became a somatic psychotherapist, it became really clear to me that one of the populations I feel strongest working with are those who suffer from religious trauma. And so that's what I'm doing. And I'm starting therapy groups. And that's that.
And at what point in your journey or your process did you sort of turn a corner, like sort of find your way through or out of that experience as being a queer person and and I imagine really struggling with your identity within that context to, the person that you are today?
Yeah, I think there's two major turning points for me. And one is that I'm constantly amazed at the information about ourselves that we are able to not know about in order to survive. I actually had no idea about any aspect of my queer identity until much later in life. But I did know that my mom was queer. She came out to me when I was a senior in high school. And I was still very much in the context where I was taught that homosexuality is the only unforgivable sin. And so it was when she came out to me, it was very terrifying. And she was at the time already involved in Exodus International, a very popular ex-gay reparative therapy organization that no longer exists because the founders of it realized they were doing far more harm than good. But she dedicated lots of her life to that. And I was really supportive of that. And it wasn't until, it's a really long story, but it wasn't until a group of activists came to my evangelical Christian college who were a bunch of queer activists wanting to do presentations on the history of religious oppression and violence. They were called the Soul Force Equality Ride. And it was the first time I ever heard anybody say that God loves and affirms people of all sexual identities. And as soon as it was said, something washed over my body. I went through a portal. And after I heard it, I was in a different world. I just believed it. I drove home. I drove 6 hours home to Sacramento and told my mom, hey, I think you're okay. I think you don't have to try to get rid of this anymore. It's okay. So that's a long story to your question, but that really started to shake the grounding that I was in. And then the second thing was how bizarre it felt to me the way that the church dealt with grief. There was a really tragic death that occurred in the church that I attended, and there was a lot of messaging of don't be sad, he's in heaven. And it just felt really wrong to me to try to bypass the amount of grief that everybody was experiencing. And so those are two things that happened that really shook the foundation. And then it took years after that to kind of clear out the rubble and to really be with the deconstruction that was happening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. So Scott, let's move over to you. And I wonder if you can share your story of growing up in a conservative religious environment and slowly coming out and discovering who you are.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to share my story. Yeah, I grew up in a pretty normal, conservative Orthodox Mormon household in Salt Lake area, Utah, in the Salt Lake Valley. And it really actually, the community of being in the Mormon church and their congregations, which are called wards. The ward that we had was actually really good when I was a kid. And I knew a lot of adults and I felt very safe with a lot of adults and trusted people and had a little friend group and everything. But as I became a teenager and started to realize I knew I was different from a young age. I didn't know the word queer or even gay or anything, but I felt different, and that was okay for a few years. And then when I started to hit puberty and stuff, I realized that what was different about me was that I was gay, that I was attracted to quote unquote the wrong gender. And I started hearing the messaging coming across the pulpit. And when I was 5, actually, the church put out this huge, big effort. They made what's called a proclamation to the world, which is now called the Family Proclamation. And it's a very interesting backstory why they did it, but how it impacted me was it was read over the pulpit. It was all about defining the family and defining marriage as heterosexual and marriage as one man and one woman. And it was supposedly produced as a legal document to help them fight gay marriage in Hawaii. But anyway, but the impact it had on me was that became a major cultural feature of Mormonism in a way that it actually hadn't been strongly prioritized before then. So I was 5, and so I really got the brunt of that as a teenager from, maybe 10 and upward is when I started to notice, like, oh, they're talking about this all the time. And it's very homophobic and transphobic, and it's very binary and fundamentally, heterosexual. And they say, it's all framed in positive language, but, it's affirming that there's only one way to have a family, basically. So, and the result on me was a drip, drip, drip of poison, basically. I like to say they kind of poisoned the well, like one drop at a time over several years. And so this community that I had felt safe in, that I trusted people, over time, I became more and more suspicious and wondering, like, what are their real motivations and what do they think about me? And I started to censor myself in how I acted and what I said, trying to be less gay and less effeminate and all that stuff for a long time. And I still really, truly believed the church, the messaging of the church and their truth claims. And I had a really tough go of it. Yeah, my family also kind of fell apart around that time. My parents got divorced. They separated when I was 15. And maybe from 15 to 18 was like the worst part of my life. And I lived with my mom, and she was crazy depressed because of the divorce. And she was sort of treated like a pariah by a lot of people in our community because of the divorce. She was now a single woman which is not a celebrated position at all in the church. She could no longer attend a lot of social events. She felt that she could no longer attend. There's no rules, but she's like, well, I can't go without a husband. And I was the most depressed I'd ever been too, because I was acting out secretly in ways that nobody else knew and feeling extremely guilty. And just a lot of self-hatred and pressure. That's the hardest part of high school, obviously, is the last couple of years. So there was a lot of difficulty. And then finally, when I got to college, I made a friend group in my first semester. And by the end of the semester, all of us had come out to each other. And we were like, how did we all find each other? Oh my gosh. It was amazing. And it still took a couple more years for me to come to terms and realize that I was gay and it wasn't changing. And I got glimpses of, like, maybe it's okay, because my friends seemed so happy and they seemed to, like, value their life and their gay life and their gay relationships. And finally, I turned a corner when I started therapy that was provided by the school. I'd previously only had therapists through the Mormon church, which is problematic. And they treated homosexuality as like a thorn in the side, as it were, something to be dealt with and like worked around. Like, nobody was trying to convert me to heterosexual. By that point, that was sort of out the window as an option, but it felt like how somebody would treat a chronic illness or a disability, where it's like, okay, you'll probably have this condition for the rest of your life, but like, let's figure out how to be a good person despite it. And that in and of itself is very, very damaging. And I've taken a long time to get over that. But anyway, I guess I'll finish by saying the turning point for me was reading a book called No More Goodbyes by a Mormon feminist and poet named Carol Lynn Pearson. And she had collected the stories of like dozens of LGBT Mormons and ex-Mormons and just shared their stories. And she's like, here's the ones that turned out badly, and here's the ones that turned out happy, and here's the ones where we're not sure how it turned out, but it's interesting. And she had love for everyone. And there's a part of the book where she says specifically, if your path keeps you in the church, I love you and support you, and I wish you the best. If your path takes you out of the church, I love you and support you and wish you the best. And if your path is unclear, I love you and support you and wish you the best. And I had never, ever heard a Mormon say that. And that changed my life. I felt like a ton of weight was lifted off my shoulders after I put the book down after reading that. And that kind of gave me the courage to move forward into the darkness and to trust what my spirit had been saying, which was like, your path lies outside the church and there's more love and joy and celebration to be had. And it was hard because I actually still really believed the Mormon theology and stuff. And it was a really tough choice, but when I stopped going, I did find, a lot of love and stuff. It was complicated. I also found a lack of spirituality because I believed that I had separated myself from God. That's how I started. That's where I come from.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really hearing in both of your stories is the struggle of feeling some kind of connection to your faith and your spiritual path, at a very core level, like really wanting and needing that and finding support there, but then being told by, outside of the, whether it be the scripture or the teachings, that's just about humanity and spirituality, that on top of that comes these messages about like, your gender or your sexual identity or what kind of relationship you can have and that kind of thing. And that's the more human part of it is the part that's like, no, that's bad. That's not going to be helpful as you walk this path. And I'm also hearing about like this importance of deconstructing your religious belief based on what these people are telling you that is not right for you, and finding your way back to, what kind of spiritual person you want to be now. And I'm wondering, if each of you could maybe speak to that about like, that a little bit more about like what kinds of things, helped you reconstruct that. You want to start, Mahrs?
I think for me, I used to get really caught up on the idea of, is it the truth? Because I was really raised to believe that there is one truth. And if you don't have that truth, then the consequences are more catastrophic than anything I can think of, right? Like an eternity in hell. To this day, I can't think of anything scarier, right? And so I used to get really, really caught up on, well, is it true? And that really blocked me from being able to have any spiritual practice. And then over the years, by being in community with queer folks, by being in community with other folks who are no longer evangelical Christian, by, just living in the Bay Area where there's so much spiritual practice, the thing that I come to now is, instead of is it true, does it work for me? I have spiritual practices. I don't know if they're true or not. Right? I don't know if my ancestors are actually available to me for sure, right? But I have an ancestor practice because it works for me. I can feel them at my back, and that does something for me that's really, really, really valuable. And then I think the other thing is really I think what religion has to offer is kind of an incredible thing, and it offers belonging and community and containment and the truth, right? That's really nice, right? Like, it's really nice to just think that you like, oh, this is it, right? And if you don't know what to do, just to ask somebody else and they'll tell you, right? There's something really wonderful about all of that. And so it was really, really terrifying to, when I deconstructed and didn't have that, be like, just like, I'm just out here in the world. I'm not contained. I don't know what truth is. I don't know where I belong. And the process of really honing in on what my actual values are as containment, of really reclaiming my body as the container that I need to be in this world, or at least a container, reclaiming sensations, emotions, desire, like I said before, are all a process, but have been really huge in my recovery from this type of trauma. Very curious about what Scott has to say, but yeah, let's.
No, yeah, I really like what you were saying about the container. I think that's really important. And I also really resonate with what you were saying about like whether or not it's true, does it work? Because I know for me in my spiritual explorations and my path, I still am just like, sometimes I think, well, is this thing that I don't even know if I would say I believe it, but this thing that I practice, is it real? Like, is this really real? Like, is what I think is out there that I can't see, is it real? Is what I think that's going to happen after I die, is that real? Is that true? Or is it just what's going to work for me while I'm here in this body right now? And I think that that's a really good place to be. And I think could be really helpful for people who are in organized religions that have no problem with what's happening in their space, to take in that concept of just like, well, is it true? But even if it's not true, I know it just works for me. I think that a lot of people, could they just say, well, this is what I believe, and I believe that it's true, but I also just believe that's just what works for me. And if it doesn't work for Scott or it doesn't work for Mahrs, then that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mahrs, could I ask, like, if you could just say something about how you've gone about reclaiming your body and sensation and desires? They're so intriguing to me, and I can make some assumptions based on your work as a somatic psychotherapist, but I'd be really curious to hear if you could say a little more about that process, because I think it is so important for folks like us.
Sure. Yeah. I think before I even came to the work of somatic psychotherapy, when I left the church, intentional community became a really big thing for me. Living in community, it was kind of a branch off of the church, right? I was like, okay, well, that doesn't work, but how can we live together, right? How can we have there be no poor among us, right? How can we like really share our lives with each other? And the first intentional community I ever lived in was a group of, it was 12 of us, and we were all had deconstructed fairly recently. And so there was something about doing that in community. I really believe that spiritual trauma, religious trauma is a group trauma and needs group spaces to be able to do a big part of the healing. The collective body really helped me grieve, really helped me be angry, and really helped me discharge a lot of the feelings that I had once I realized that my upbringing was abusive. And then from there, going into somatic therapy training, I was pretty disconnected from my body, even going into that training, but just learning about sensations, learning about how every emotion is a set of sensations, and to just be with those sensations and let them move through, learning that every emotion has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you just actually let yourself feel it, then it can move through your body within seconds. Sure, there could be waves, but learning that it's not dangerous, that it's actually dangerous to not do that, to not be with your body was huge. And I'm still finding ways. There's no like, this is the thing that worked for me. And I think it's my life work is to figure out how to be a body. But those are some things that were really, really helpful to me.
Thank you. Good to hear.
So, Scott, I wonder if you could share some of the sources and ways that you found through reconstructing your spiritual self.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. The first one that I stumbled upon that really helped me was, first I wrote poetry just to describe like what is happening. I had a physical sensation, a loss of physical sensation after I left the church. And I wrote a poem called Anti-Baptism, and it was describing like this lack of feeling in my head that I no longer felt the spirit. And it felt like I had an antenna that like picked up on God's signal and stuff. And all of a sudden the antenna had been unplugged or something. And so I just tried to describe it in like whatever terms I could. And then a little while after that, when I was moving forward in life and I realized like I have so many questions and I have so few answers about like, what do I believe about God? What do I believe about sex and sin? And what about drugs or alcohol or even coffee? Because, Mormons are forbidden from so many substances. And I had basically been taught that like cigarettes were as bad as coffee, were as bad as meth, were as bad as marijuana, and it was all just bad, and I should abstain from all of it. And that's not true in reality. So I was like, I don't know, and I don't know what immoral or moral drug use looks like. And I just had all these questions that were holding me back from acting. And I took this thing that I called intentional apathy. I made it up myself, and I wrote these questions down on pieces of paper and put them in a jar. And I said, like, I'm not going to worry about those questions right now. Like, they're here. I can come back to them when I'm ready. But I'm going to go live life and do my best day by day and just like see what I can learn. And then I'm going to come back to these questions later. And that actually freed up a lot of what was holding me back. And I, tried different things and I made new friends and I had different experiences. And when I came back to the jar, maybe a couple of years later, I had moved with it a couple of times. I took it with me. I graduated college and stuff in the meantime. And when I came back, I had a lot of answers to a lot of the questions. I was like, oh, I actually do know what I think about sex and alcohol and stuff because I've listened to people and I've tried stuff out and I've made mistakes and I've had wins and whatever. And then the questions about God and the afterlife, I realized that they had grown less important to me because I had become so involved in living the life that's here and now. Yeah, and I embraced agnosticism, and then I embraced the gray areas. And like you've both kind of said, like it mattered less like what the final true answer is about God or spirituality or death. And it mattered more to me that I was open to learning and open to not understanding and like open to the mystery of it all. And fundamentally, that has been the case for me for several years. I have developed different sophisticated spiritual practices and beliefs and stuff, but fundamentally, I always have claimed agnosticism. And yeah, I sometimes say to people, like, if everything I experience, like spiritually, resides only in my body and is just a series of chemical and physical reactions, that's completely fine. Like, it's completely fine if there's no supernatural forces or a ghost passing through me or a spirit touching me or God directing things at all, because all that I know is sensation. That's truly all that I can ever know is electrical impulses and chemicals in my body. And if spirituality and religious terminology or practices helps me to describe my experiences on the inside and describe the symbols that I see in life and the patterns and all that jazz, that's completely fine. And I can live a life of mostly rationality, based on science and everything, as well as I can pick up these spiritual frames when they make sense. And when they're able to speak to things that science isn't ready to or doesn't want to. Science doesn't want to answer all these questions, actually. And it's fine. For me, it feels just fine to pick up spiritual frames and lenses that can help address those. So I guess coming around to that multi-frame approach has helped me as well, where in certain circumstances, I can say to myself, like, well, let's see what science has to say, And in others, I can say, like, well, let's see what the tarot cards have to say. And let's see what the witch that I follow online has to say about this. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as I'm trying to use my best judgment on which frame to hold on which question. Yeah, so in a nutshell, those are some of the things that have helped me get to this point. And the last one was just examples. Like just learning by example of meeting other spiritual people who are queer and various different flavors, and understanding, like, just watching them and like, how do you live and how do you practice, and getting to know them as friends and as mentors. That's been huge for me to help me understand what actually is possible.
I really like the idea of intentional apathy. I think that's a really good practice to have. I want to pause briefly and invite you to join the Queer Spirit community. This is a new private space free from the distractions of our previous Facebook group. Here we can gather together in a virtual community of our own co-creation to continue discussions on the topics from the podcast, but most of all to connect with other queer folks on a spiritual path. To join us in our new space, simply go to queerspirit.mn.co. That's queerspirit.m as in Mary, n as in Nancy.co. You can also find the link in the show notes. Okay, now back to our conversation. I have to ask, what do you still have that jar? And if not, what happened to it?
Oh man, yeah, I don't still have it. I think it may be at my mom's house in Utah. Yeah, I believe that I took it. I went to Taiwan for a year and a half after I graduated college, and I definitely had it in Taiwan. And then I spent like a couple months at my mom's house, and then I moved into Canada for 6 months, and I don't think it made it to Canada. So it's likely in a box or under my bed or something at my mom's place. When I no longer had a need for it, I just sort of left it. Yeah.
It's no longer a practice that you feel is necessary for you?
No, not right now. I still have questions, but they're a lot more practical. Just like, what's the next move for my career? And the spiritual questions, they all swirl around too, but I have more comfort with the not knowing. And I'm more comfortable holding, like I said, like the mystery.
You embodied the jar.
Yeah, exactly. I absorbed the jar, and now I can be intentionally apathetic whenever I need.
So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about your work that each of you do. So Mahrs, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the groups that you are running for folks who've had similar experiences.
I would love to. Yeah, I'm really excited about it's the next chapter in my work. It's newer. I've had a private practice for a number of years and working mostly with individuals, with a lot of individuals who have religious trauma, and have found that like we can do a lot of really great work individually, and it kind of feels like I've been hitting this wall a little bit of like, okay, where do we go from here? And I was thinking about that a lot and thinking about how trauma in itself is very relational and so needs relationship to heal, and started to think about how religious trauma is relational, but very specifically in a group setting. And so the next logical conclusion to me was that it needs groups to kind of get into some of those cracks and crevices of the healing that personal individual work, and even with one other person, I don't think can really get in there. I think a big part of that is because the church offers so much belonging. And even the language of the church, we call it Christianese. I wonder, Scott, if there's a Mormonese, there's a really cool book by a woman named Amanda Montell called Cultish. She talks about the language that cults use in order to create a sense of belonging. And, she defines cult anything from like Jim Jones to Mormonism, Christianity to CrossFit, kind of, very wide range. That Christianity offers so much belonging. And one of the ways is through language. There's an inside group and there's an outside group. And so this next evolution of my work is to start groups that will not be cults, but will be places that people can come to process what happened, to find resonance with other people, and that for it to be a really spacious process, for there to be a lot of feeling into your body about it too. And I've told my story of growing up Christian a million times, but it wasn't until I started telling it from a place of really trying to practice feeling the sensations of it that things actually really started to shift for me. So yeah, I have my first group is actually starting this week, the Queer Survivors of Evangelical Religious Trauma. That's how I've been marketing it, but in the process of forming it, I did actually open it up to other religions as well. And I think after this, I'll start one that isn't just for queer folks. That's for everybody. But I think I'll always have a queer one and then an open one. And that's where it's at now. And I'm really hoping that it's going to turn into retreats. And I'm just really open to where this is going. But that's the idea as of right now.
And Mahrs, for people who maybe don't know much about somatic psychology or what that looks like or can be like, you mentioned telling your story and really feeling the sensations that come up. Can you say a little bit more like what those sensations might be like for someone? So maybe a listener might get an idea of like how they could identify that experience in themselves.
Absolutely. Great question. It's going to be different for everybody. And the truth of the matter is, for those who have experienced religious trauma, we've been taught that the body is a dangerous place to be. And so feeling those sensations can be anything from a deep relief of, oh, here I am, and it feels so good to feel myself, to a really overwhelming and seemingly dangerous experience that can kind of be re-traumatizing in a way, right? So with that wide range, there's no like one answer, but I would say that if you're somebody who that being in your body is a really overwhelming experience, to let that be okay and to start really small, like to just practice feeling your hands, right? Or to practice even feeling the space around your hands, right? Practice feeling your feet or the space around your feet. To find a practitioner, a trauma-informed practitioner who can kind of help you with feeling those sensations, because it can be really overwhelming. Right? I've been really intentionally being with sensations for a long time, and sensations can be really overwhelming, which is another reason why I think group work is so important. I think some sensations can't actually be processed alone. They need more bodies to help process a larger container. Does that answer your question, Nick?
Yeah, thank you. And Scott, can you share a little bit more about the work that you are doing with folks from similar communities?
Yeah, I will. I guess I'm hesitating because I have kind of two that sort of get to it. One is more explicitly about people who have left what I call restrictive religion, called Reconstruction Crew. And it's also new. We've met once, and it's going to be a monthly group. We're going to meet again in a week or so. And it's for anybody, all genders and orientations, anyone who has spent time in a religion they found restrictive. I use kind of that open-ended word, and would like community, as a reconstructive spiritual path that looks right for them. The other piece that I'll mention is that I have started and run a monthly group called Queer Bedtime Stories that meets both in person and online. And it's not specifically for anybody, who's coming from a religious background. It's not explicitly spiritual, but I do think in getting together queer people in a soft space where we learn about queerness and queer history and see what queer artists have to say about our experience. And I think there's a lot of resonance and overlap as far as the healing that can occur in the transformation. Maybe more of a soft, indirect re-embodiment and re-spiritualization in that sense. So I'll leave that one there. But for the Reconstruction Crew, I'm a new life coach. And so that group is a space for people to meet, share their experiences, get to know each other, build camaraderie, and then learn from one another. So I will usually do a small, mini coaching session for the group and talk about a skill or a trait or a practice that has worked for me or a client. We might, practice it together if we have the time in that mini group session. And then, I always want to include a moment of kind of like awe and reflection. So we're going to start with a song that might mean something to us, and I give everybody the chance to really enjoy it and to give feedback. And so there's some elements of the group that could be considered analogous to like a small Bible study or something. Instead of starting with a prayer, we start with listening to a song. And I intentionally, and I'm openly and transparent about recreating some of those elements from a church experience that are effective, that work in bringing people together and bringing people into one shared emotional state. Because I've found in my own experience and talking to other people who have also left, who were integrated in a religion and then left, that's the piece that a lot of us are missing, is that community spirituality piece, and where we all kind of gather around one text or one item and we look at it together and say, wow, this is really fascinating or meaningful. And, we all have different experiences with that artifact, whether it's a scripture or a song or anything. But the fact of the gathering and looking at kind of a third object, I find that important. So that's a little snapshot, I guess, of some of the stuff we do in my group. And I look forward to seeing what it becomes. I do hope it will be, group informed. I'm also not going to make a cult. And I will always embody, and repeat the phrase that like everybody's path is going to look different. And that's a good thing. I don't want to recreate any dogma or cult of personality or anything. So it's a loose container, but if people show up and continue to show up, they will find camaraderie and community and resonance. Like I like to use that word, Mahrs, resonance with their stories and with others.
Yeah, thank you for sharing both about your practices. And what I'm drawn to again is this idea of working in groups with groups and the healing power of that. And Scott, I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about, how you feel that shows up with your groups.
Yeah. Well, I can share, like how it has shown up for me historically, which informs, what I'm doing with my groups. So I took like a lot of years away from just Mormonism in general. But 4 or 5 years ago, I went to, and I found out about this group called Affirmation, which is for anybody at the intersection of Mormon and queer, basically, including ex-Mormons, including queer allies and that sort of thing. And I went to a 2-day conference. And I was really confused because I went to the first night and it was sort of a show and tell. It was like, here's all these organizations and people who are working on the issue. It was all very positive. And I went home and I felt horrible. Like my body was shaking and everything. And I thought about it and prayed about it and journaled about it. And I realized that I was having a strong physical reaction because I heard people talking in Mormon, basically like you were saying, Mahrs, like Mormonese, Mormonish, like they had the same dialects and the same accents, and it didn't matter that they were saying really positive things because my body heard Mormon voices. And that's when I realized the extent of like the trauma that I had in Mormon community, and showing up and going to those spaces and reminding myself, in between sessions, sometimes I'd get a breath of fresh air and have to think and pray and be like, remember, Scott, like these people, they are Mormon, and also they affirm you for being gay. That's like the whole point of this. And I really had to hold my own hand and really make connections and friends there in order to find some healing. And that was really surprising because as I had differentiated and individuated myself from the community, I sort of thought I was like done, that I was going to be fine. But there was this old, long-standing trauma that was still stored in my body that I just hadn't experienced because I had been avoiding groups of Mormons. And I'd also moved to California, and it's really easy to avoid Mormons here. There's just not a lot of them. Turns out that had been serving me to avoid the source of trauma. And so that's been my experience. And I was shocked, but, I've learned that as people, we are such social creatures and we deserve, healthy and robust communities. It's our birthright as a social species. And so that's why it's so important to me to help people reintegrate into groups, because I think that's how we find our greatest healing. It's kind of a superpower to have a good community. It unlocks so much more of our individual potentials. Yeah, I'm curious, if you resonate, it sounds like Mahrs, you entered that intentional community or a few of them after leaving, and that was big for you. Did you ever feel isolated or have the desire to run away, or were you always kind of engaged in a group setting?
Mm-hmm. Such a great question. I think, yes, I have felt very isolated, and I have the desire to leave. Group settings can be a big one. I guess something I'm thinking about right now too is how I think religious trauma is often thought of as just something that people who grew up like really directly religious experience. But I also tend to think of it on a broader level too, of how our social context, and at least I'll just speak to the United States, is formed by, like, I love your terminology, restrictive religion, but it's formed by restrictive religious principles. And so I think that even people who didn't grow up with direct religious trauma are swimming in an ocean that's polluted by it, right? And so groups, there's a tension in groups, and that I don't think that we really know how to do it yet, right? And what do I mean by we? Maybe I don't really know how to do it yet. And I've been a part of a lot of groups who don't really know how to do it yet. It's messy, right? Groups are messy. There's a lot of feeling, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of power dynamics that happen. And it's beautiful, right? It's the everything that's all right there. One of my favorite definitions of religious trauma, I don't know if it's a definition, but there's a woman named Carolyn Baker, and she says the crux of all religious trauma is the delusion that one can and should transcend the human condition. And the human condition is to be a body, and to be a body in relationship with other bodies, to connect and to belong with other bodies. So figuring out how to do that is really tricky in our social context, I think, and absolutely essential. That's a puzzle that I feel really curious about continuing to be with. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Scott?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And thank you for saying that. And I agree. I think in America, we fall short in a very unique way in communities because we've been inspired by so many of the myths of individuality and individual achievement in ways that didn't necessarily impact other countries. I've lived in the UK and Taiwan and Vancouver, and all three of them have such strong social safety nets and strong communities. I remember in Vancouver, like I saw a flyer that said like, hey, our neighborhood is getting like $3,000 from the government as our part of our annual neighborhood like social fund. How do we want to use it? Like show up at this place. And they're like, do we want to do movie nights? Do we want to do this? Do we want to do that? And I just was dumbfounded, like, what? Like the government actually just gives money to neighborhoods? Holy crap. Like
an investment in belonging.
Yeah, and it's like you can use it however you want, like the local community, and it's supposed to just be events that bring people together. And that blew my mind because it seems so simple and obvious, and I had just not ever thought of it before because I've been stuck in America, where we have these myths of individual achievement. And I agree. I think this is a very important problem and a very important puzzle for us to continue to figure out together.
Together is the key word there, right?
Amen.
So before we wrap up, I want to end with my final question that I always ask everyone. So I'm going to ask each of you to answer this separately. But can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish? Who wants to go first?
I'll share a person, and one of my spiritual mentors and uncles and elders named Matthew Bronson. He's been a huge support for me in the last few years. He's rare. He's a rarity, a gay man in his 60s who's seen a lot. He's been in the Bay Area for decades. He's been on the ground in activism, in spiritual work with gay men and queer people. And so he's been a wealth of information and support. He has really inspired me and instilled a sense of queer leadership, and he's put in time and effort in developing it within me. And I will be eternally grateful. So yeah, Matthew Bronson is a person that's allowed me to flourish.
And Mahrs?
I'm also going to pick a person. When I was in my undergrad at a conservative Christian college, there was a really beautiful human named Joe Chase who befriended me because I was wearing Birkenstocks, and so were they. And they started a Bible study called Bitchin' Bible Study that they invited me to. And it really did start as a Bible study, and then it just became like a deconstruction study where a group of us really started to bring the questions that we never felt safe to bring. And I will just be forever grateful for Joe and inviting me to that and starting that. I've interviewed a lot of people with religious trauma in the last few years, and it breaks my heart that so many people deconstruct alone. And I'm just so grateful that I didn't have to do it alone, because it was terrifying and isolating enough to do it with others. And something else I'll say about Joe, they're a singer-songwriter based out of Los Angeles. Joe is spelled Joh. They are just so who they are. And they always have been unapologetically, authentically themselves. And that has been a really huge inspiration to me as I've really been taught to be who other people want me to be. Thank you, Joe Chase. I love that question. Thank you, Nick.
So before I let you go, can you both share where people can find you and connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yes, people can connect with me on Instagram is the easiest way right now. My personal Instagram is Scott_strolls, like walks, Scott Strolls. And if you want to follow my Queer Bedtime Stories events, that's at Instagram at Queer Bedtime. Just the first two words.
And Mahrs?
I think the best place to find me for now is my website, www.therapywithmahrs.com. Mahrs is spelled Mahrs. I will eventually have a website just for religious trauma stuff, but until then, that's the best place to find me.
Great. Well, I also have those links in the show notes and people can find them there. But thank you both for being here and sharing your stories about deconstructing and reconstructing your religious experiences and rebuilding your own spiritual path and bringing that healing forward to others.
Thank you so much, Nick, for hosting and asking these great questions, and Mahrs for amazing information and conversation.
Same to the both of you. This is really wonderful. Talk about this in groups.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by following the show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be well.